So you've decided that you want to plant some new paddock trees on your property, and there's some things that you probably need to think about before you get started. Are you going to purchase a prefabricated guard, or are you going to make your own like this? The three things that you need to consider when choosing an appropriate guard are the type of stock that you run on your property, so whether you have sheep or horses or goats or cattle, and your grazing regime, whether you set stock or rotationally graze, because both of those considerations will affect the stock pressure that's going to be put on these guards and the amount of time that these guards will have pressure on them. The third thing that you need to consider is your capacity as a farmer to install them on your property, and whether you have the strength and the resources to bend sheets of Rio, or whether it's more straightforward for you to buy a prefabricated guard that comes pre-rolled, which is easier to transport and to put into place. Whether you choose to buy a prefabricated guard or make your own, there are three things that you need to consider. The first is the diameter of the guard, because this dictates the reach into the centre where your tree is planted. The next thing to consider is the opening mesh size, as it also influences what animals can get their heads inside the mesh. The third consideration is the height of your guard, because if you're running horses or you have taller cattle, the browsing reach to the top will start to affect your plant on the inside. So when we're talking about making our own guards, there's a few things to think about. So what went wrong with this guard, Anthony?
Well, this tree guard, it's actually over 10 years old, and so this was an early attempt at a homemade one, because they were a lot and you couldn't really buy any, so I made my own out of concrete Rio mesh, and I made it, the diameter's too small and the holes in the Rio mesh is too big, and the cattle could get their snouts in, and literally you can see the result of the tree. For a 10-year-old sapling, it's just nothing. It's never got a chance to grow, that the cattle just continually lick the leaves off. And so really it was a complete failure. So this tree guard is a different variant. It was sort of Mark II, same age tree, it's about 10 years old, natural re-veg or regen that came up in the paddock, and I put a guard on it, stop the cattle eating it. To try and economise on how much mesh I was using, I only made this guard originally half height, but I found the cattle were leaning in over the top, eating the top of the tree, so I extended it. I put an extra top on it, and that's worked relatively well. So that guard, that's probably 6 or 8 years old, and it's still, as you can see, the cattle haven't bent it up, and it'll soon be, the tree will be big enough for me to take this off and reuse it somewhere else. This tree guard's one of the commercial prefab tree guards that come pre-rolled. I overlap mine a little bit because it gives them better structural strength when the cattle are pushing on them. Otherwise, if they're just butt joined, I found they move, and once they start to move, they become loose and the cattle just push them over. I picked this spot because it's where an old tree used to be. I'm a believer in water divining, and it actually shows there's underground moisture here, so I planted this tree here. He's one that I planted. But still, with the smaller diameter guards, the cattle, even though it's got smaller squares in these mesh, the cattle have still managed to lick and nip the ends off him, so hasn't grown as well as he should have if he'd been in a bigger diameter guard, but he's here, he's better than he would have been. This tree guard, after a number of trial and errors, this is the tree guard that I like to make myself. I prefab them, made out of concrete Rio mesh. I've tried the F72 mesh, but it's a bit too heavy and too expensive. This is F62, which is a good compromise. Any lighter than that and the cattle bend them up. We rotationally graze, so at different times they do have a lot of cattle pushing on them. Then they have a break, but during that pressure period they have to stand up to a fair bit of rubbing and pushing. These ones, I like them sitting on the ground, even though they do rust away a little bit over the years, but I've had some that they're now on their 3rd tree and the bottom is still intact, so I figure that's a pretty good run. But the reason for sitting them flat on the ground and making them circular is just the lateral strength, and also this overlap. It gives you the best structural strength. There's no flex, there's no movement in the guard itself. Sitting flat on the ground, the cattle can't get much leverage. If they push on this side, they just push the other side into the ground and it doesn't move, because once it starts to move, the steel pickets get loose and they'll start and lift them out of the ground. We've actually had some of the smaller guards with the horn cattle hook their horns in the guard and actually lift them clean out of the ground, star pickets and all. Particularly with new star pickets, I like to use second-hand star pickets because they get a better grip on the ground. The rust on the bottom, they bed in and they won't move as much. I also drive them in at least usually 3 feet, which is a long way in, but that's what keeps them in the ground, because that's the key reason to hold it down. Also use the old number 8 fencing wire. Any fences I pull down, I save the wire, and I use that to twitch them up. This one, I use the Rio mesh itself to twitch it together. That's pretty hard work, so on all the ones I make now, I just use the number 8 fencing wire to twitch every second joint right down. So on a guard like this, I'd have 10 joiners all the way down, twitching them together. It takes a bit of time to put them together, but it pays off. As I said, I've got some guards that they're now onto their 3rd tree, and so it pays off. Whereas the lighter guards, they're a bit more economical straight up, but the cattle destroy them. So you either end up with no tree at all because the cattle push it over and destroy the tree, or that tree grows, but then you have to throw it in the scrap.
So these trees are 3 years old. This will be their 3rd winter. And I just wanted to show you the importance of tying those together and making that opening on that guard secure. Once it starts to come apart, cattle are going to be able to get their heads in through here, and you're going to get this sort of browsing that's unfortunately happened to this red box. So really important that these stay close. And the other thing that we want to demonstrate here is that star pickers have to be driven in, you know, a good decent way, you know, 1/3 at least to half of that height should be in the ground, especially for this because it acts as a big lever, and when you've got 600 kilos of cattle weight on that, they're just going to be able to push into this, rub, scratch and eat your tree. So if you find that the cattle are really scratching hard on your guards and putting a lot of pressure on them, maybe it's worth considering some other options for scratching in the paddock. That might be retaining fallen timber or extra posts spread around the place, or you might be able to design something like this steel cattle scratcher to give your stock somewhere to scratch that itch. When it comes to planting your new paddock tree, you have 2 options. You can protect some recruitment that's come up naturally in the paddocks, like you see here, or you can plant a tube stock. And there are pros and cons to both options. So one of the benefits of protecting natural regen is that they're usually pretty tough species. So if you have a parent tree nearby and you get a bit of seed dropped out, they're going to come up by themselves quite liberally, especially if they're river red gum. So one of the important things to do is to choose a tree that's a healthy and good looking specimen, and probably not one that's been grazed like this has. So pick your best looking tree, the strongest and healthiest out of the patch, and that's the one that you'll protect. You might even need to consider thinning and removing some of the others around it to make sure that that tree has adequate space to grow and become a nice big branching tree. The benefits of protecting natural recruitment is that your tree will probably grow faster and stronger because it hasn't had its roots disturbed through the planting process. The 3 trees that you see behind me were protected with a big rainwater tank, and that was enough protection to allow them to get well established. If the objective of your planting is for stock shade, it's really important to choose a tree that's going to make a robust paddock tree, so not something with stringy bark that the cattle are going to like to pull off. If you're planting for biodiversity, it's a really great idea to have a good mix of plants across your property that are indigenous to your area. It's also an opportunity to introduce species that have been lost over time. You can buy tube stock from your native nursery and look at the re-veg guides for your local area to determine which will work on your country and your soil type. That way we can plant missing species back into the landscape that will benefit our fauna. The other benefit of planting tube stock is that you can choose the exact location where you need shade on your property and plant trees according to the needs at that site. Every property is different, and the needs of your property may be different to your neighbours. You need to consider the size of your property, what time you have available for planting, and that will help to determine what you want to achieve on your property. Greta Valley Landcare Group is really passionate about helping to get more paddock trees out in our landscape, and we'd encourage you to give us a ring if we can help provide some more information to help get you going on your property.